other country, some U.S. firms try to apply their own American business models rather than adapting to the host nation. A move former GE chief Jack Welch likens to fitting a square peg in a round hole. Here's what he had to say about Google's ambitions in China earlier on CNBC.
You're playing in somebody else's rules, in somebody else's playpen, and you want to make it the rules your rules. That doesn't always go. I mean, China doesn't, they're not making this rule up as a surprise.
Interesting point. Let's bring in Dan Harris with Harris & Moore, a Seattle-based law firm with offices in Qingdao, China. Dan Griswold will join us shortly. He's with the Cato Institute's Center for Trade and Policy Studies. Welcome. First of all, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Dan, what about Jack Welch's assertion that it's, the square peg, round hole scenario? Or can U.S. companies take some of what some of their culture here in the United States and apply it to doing business overseas, whether it's China or elsewhere?
I would agree with Jack Welch that when an American company goes into China, they are going into China's playground. And that means they need to operate under China's rules. At the same time, that doesn't mean they have to abandon all of their business operations, their methods, and even their morals.
But what about bribes, which are very common in other countries, right? And yet, American companies are not allowed to do what is very common in many foreign countries, which is pay bribes to get business. So where's the cutoff? If you're going to play by the rules, then in theory, to follow a parity of logic there, you could pay bribes in other countries where it's very common and part of the business culture.
Well, I would disagree with that. It may be common in China, but it is illegal in China. And in most instances, it's not even a good way to do business.
So what should Rio Tinto do, for instance? I mean, obviously it is common in China to pay bribes, and now Rio Tinto finds itself with several employees that have been put in prison. They're going to go on trial. How should they handle that particular situation, do you think? Are they handling it correctly?
Well, it's not all that common for foreign companies to pay bribes in China. It may be common for domestic companies in China to pay bribes, but I don't believe it's common for foreign companies to pay bribes. And as far as Rio Tinto goes, I'm not sure how they should handle it in light of the fact that a number of their employees just pled guilty to engaging in bribery.
Mr. Harris, why is this with Google coming up now? It's not as though Google didn't know, as Welch pointed out earlier, that country was going to censor, restrict search results. Why are they now on their high horse?
Good question, and I'm not sure anyone really has an answer to that. As you know, Google came into China approximately 4 years ago, signed an agreement with China regarding its censoring or self-censoring search results. So the question is, why now? There are many reasons given, ranging from the fact that Google is alleging that it was hacked by the Chinese government. Other people are saying that it was due to the fact that Google has come to the conclusion that it cannot compete with Baidu in search in China. And others, and this is really where I come down at this point anyway, are saying that that Google simply got tired of engaging in self-censorship.
Dan Griswold, could part of the problem also be that China has one foot in communism, but one very large foot in capitalism, and it's very common for people to forget about the communist aspect of China because we focus so much on the capitalist aspect of China? Dan Griswold.
This is where communist China is brushing up against capitalist China. And the communist government doesn't like the kind of things that people are accessing on Google, and yet modern capitalism needs information to thrive. And I think China is going to pay an increasing price for the chill that this is going to put over access to information.
But what does Google do, though? I mean, does Google make the right decision? You outline the problem in China. We all get it. We all understand that. But now companies have to do business there. So how do they get a framework about how they make a decision about whether or not they go in, knowing that that tension exists?
It's a decision every company has to make. Most companies that invest in China aren't getting anywhere close to the rules in China about censorship. But information is Google's business. And so it might be unique, or at least unusual. I think it's entirely up to Google to make the decision. I can't fault them for pulling out. They're not in the censorship business. The Chinese government is.
But we know,
so I think
we've
the
known
decision by Google is probably a good one.
We've known from the experience of lots of media companies, whether it's News Corp or Google or others, that China had its own peculiar rules, as other sort of state-controlled countries do, Cuba or Iran or North Korea, and so it just I'm perplexed that this becomes a big issue right now.
Well, it shouldn't be a big issue right now. It's just one company deciding they're not going to do business in China under the rules that the Chinese government has dictated. And frankly, it's not such a big hit for Google.
It's expected to be the biggest economy in the world in under 10 years. It's a huge business market. So it's not just, don't you think you're underplaying that a little bit?
Well, right now, Google's only getting 1 or 2% of its income, for its revenue from China. Only 3% of its workforce is there. You're right, it's the world's biggest market right now in terms of internet users, but not anywhere near the biggest in terms of revenue.
But you know what I'm not getting out of either
Google's
one of you
doing
guys?
the right thing. They have their brand name to protect, by the way.
Well, okay, there we get maybe a criteria. I don't get either out. What is the sleep at night factor here, right? You have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to do business in a country, and there's got to be a set of rules or frameworks that you think about yourself to decide what is acceptable and what isn't. And I don't hear anything out of either one of you, except maybe some monetary issues, which is what we had from our guest yesterday. It was all about, well, you know, Rio Tinto's 50% of their business in China, so they stay, and Google's 1%, so they don't stay. So it's about money?
No, it's not just about money. In fact, I think Google is acting on its corporate principles, and I think U.S. companies have to make that decision. They have to look out for their brand name, their own internal principles when they decide where to invest.
Dan Harris, you want to reply to that?
Yes, I agree with what Mr. Griswold said. I think that if you look at it strictly from an economic perspective, Google's leaving China does not make sense, and therefore I think we have to conclude that there were other reasons, and presumably those reasons are, in fact, Google standing on its principles.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
A tricky country to do business in under any